Thank you all for being here. I'm Harold Mock, Director of Georgia College's Leadership Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Georgia College and to our Usery Forum on Leadership featuring the Honorable Cathy Cox. The goal of the Usery Forum is to explore ideas and to initiate community-wide discussions about leadership, in particular about leadership that brings people together. As we focus tonight on leadership that brings people together, leadership that is based in the community and attentive to the needs of others. On that note, many of you know that our Georgia College family is mourning the loss of a dear member of our community, Madison Tasker. Maddie passed away this past Thursday after an acute battle with leukemia. She was a fourth-year honors student on track to graduate in May with a bachelor's degree in nursing. And if you are a person who prays, I ask that you hold her parents, Trey and Sherry, as well as her step-parents, Chris and Felix, in your prayers, along with her brothers, her sisters, and her friends. So if you will, let's hold a moment of silence in honor of Madison Tasker. Thank you. Now, I said that the purpose of the Usery Forum is for us to look at leadership that brings people together. And those are things that we don't think about enough. Leadership that brings people together. We often think about leadership that we maybe see on TV. We think about politicians, or we think about people who maybe play leaders on TV, things like that. But honest, genuine leadership requires us to dig in, to focus on the communities that we live in, often to serve people around us. And that's what we want to do in our Usery Forum. As we have today, our goal is to bring fascinating leaders to Georgia College, to hear their stories and their ideas, and to engage with them in ways that we're not always able to in a classroom or in a lecture series. We want our forums to be engaging and to be insightful and enjoyable, and we rely on your good questions and comments to stimulate discussion, both tonight before we leave and in the days to come. So as our presenter, Cathy Cox, shares her ideas and comments with us this evening, consider questions and ideas that you might have, things that you might like to ask her, things that might come up in the next few days that you'd like to bring up in a class discussion. Are there ideas or conversations that maybe you have this evening that would warrant a follow-up conversation with somebody you meet here tonight? Maybe there's a topic you'd like to look at in more depth. We have papers on the table for you to jot down notes, and please likewise share your ideas and thoughts with us using the hashtag #ForThePublicGood. I should end by noting that this evening's event was made possible by the generosity of two wonderful members of our community, Melvin and Lisa Usery. We're proud to have Mr. and Mrs. Usery with us this evening, and I encourage you to continue chatting with them today and at future forums. With that, I'd like to invite Emerson Kleider to the podium. Emerson will provide an introduction to Dean Cathy Cox.
I have the honor of introducing Miss Cathy Cox, who is currently the Dean and Professor of Law at Mercer University. She was Georgia's 25th Secretary of State. Cathy Cox was named Dean of Mercer University Law School on July 1st, 2017. She previously served as President of Young Harris College and Georgia's Secretary of State. In 1986, magna cum laude graduate of Mercer Law School, Cox is the first alumna to lead the school, other than on an interim basis, since William Augustus Boodle, who was dean from 1933 to 1937. Cox served as the 21st president of Young Harris from 2007 to 2017, leading its transition from a 2-year college to a 4-year institution and overseeing unprecedented growth. Prior to assuming the Young Harris presidency, Cox served 2 terms as Georgia's Secretary of State and was the first woman in the state's history to be elected to the post, first in 1998 and again in 2002. As Secretary of State, she moved the largest division of her office from Atlanta to Macon and instituted a universal electronic voting system to improve the accuracy of the state's elections, making Georgia the first American state to do so. A native of Bainbridge, Cox began her political career as a member of the Georgia House of Representatives, where from 1993 to 1996, she represented Miller, Seminole, Early, and Decatur counties. Before being elected Secretary of State, she served for 2 years as Assistant Secretary of State. She has remained an active member of the State Bar of Georgia, and in 2011 was presented with the Traditions of Excellence Award for General Practice by the State Bar's General Practice and Trials section. Please welcome me in introducing Miss Cathy Cox.
Thank you very much, Emerson, for your kind introduction. I look forward to trying to recruit you into law school here very soon. Thank you, Dr. Mock, for the invitation to join you today. Dr. Dorman, it's great to see you again. We had lots of fun opportunities to be together as part of the Peach Belt Conference when I was president at Young Harris, and it's great to be on your campus again today. And Mr. and Ms. Usery, thank you for your sponsorship of this wonderful forum, and belated birthday wishes to you, Ms. Usery, as well. She's got a very cool Elvis Presley purse here that some of you might want to try to sneak away from her that she got for her birthday at Graceland. But seriously, it is really a wonderful chance to be with you tonight and to talk about leadership. I'm glad that many of you are interested in leadership because leadership is very much a learned skill. Some people may try to tell you that great leaders are born, but don't believe it. Some people do have the good fortune, perhaps, to grow up and develop some characteristics that make good leaders. They might grow up learning to be empathetic, to be good listeners, to become good creative problem solvers. But truthfully, leadership can be learned. So I'm glad you have strong programs like this forum sponsored by the Userys and other classes, courses, and programs here at Georgia College to help you develop leadership skills as students, regardless of what you might have learned as a child. So tonight, I want to start by asking you all a question. It involves politics. Do you believe that Bernie Sanders really said to Elizabeth Warren that he did not believe a woman could be elected president? Do you believe he said that? Maybe another way to ask you a question is, how many of you wonder whether a woman can be elected president of the United States? Anybody wonder that? Nobody's willing to acknowledge that they wonder that? Well, here's even another question I pose to you. Is that even a fair question to ask today? Some of you, if you're keeping up with politics, may have heard about the little dust-up a couple of weeks ago between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, where it was sort of a he said, she said thing, where Elizabeth Warren accused Bernie Sanders of claiming that he said to her a year or two ago that a woman could not be elected president. And then when they had a debate, after the end of the debate, she was accusing him of calling her a liar and vice versa during the debate, and it was heard on an open mic, and it became a big thing. But afterwards, CNN decided to actually put a poll out in the field across the country to ask Americans what they thought about this. And so they asked this question: generally speaking, Do you think a woman can win the presidency of the United States or not? Anybody know how that came out? Well, only 15% of registered voters said no. 15% of all voters. That's not so bad. But I'm sort of saddened to tell you that more than twice the number of women than men said no. How about that? 1 in 5 women, almost 20% of women, said they did not think a woman could win the presidency, whereas only 9% of men said no. Double the number of women naysayers of whether a woman could be elected president of the United States. Now, I pose this question to you this afternoon for several reasons, but number one, because it's a question that I have had to fight in a different format. Nobody's ever asked me if I was going to become president of the United States, nor did I ever want to become president of the United States. But I've had to fight a form of this question for more than 20 years since I first ran for political office. And to tell you the truth, I'm really ticked off that we're still asking this question. I had certainly hoped and believed that by the time we got into the 21st century, we would not be asking whether or not women could win elections, any elections. Here's a little of my history. When I first went back to my hometown of Bainbridge, Georgia, down in deep South Georgia, to practice law, I was the first and only woman to ever practice law in that county. And not just in Bainbridge, but in the 10 counties around Bainbridge. So a lot of people felt compelled to ask this crazy question. Can a woman really be a good lawyer? Duh. Can a woman handle the tough stuff that goes on in a courtroom? Is she going to cry when the judge yells at her? Well, I just had to go out and win a few high-profile jury trials to put the question to rest. I ran for the legislature when I was 32 years old, and you can bet that a lot of people did not take me seriously. A number of people pulled me aside and said, "You really ought to start with the school board or the city council first before you run for the legislature." A lot of particularly older men would give me these patronizing little looks and say, "Well, this will be good experience for you, and you'll win a race down the road." Well, I was challenging a 16-year incumbent member of the House when I decided to run, so I guess it's not surprising that a lot of people thought I was crazy. But even he did not take me seriously and didn't even start campaigning until about 2 weeks before the election. But by then, I had outworked him with my 3 mighty sisters in all 4 of the counties where I had to run, and I beat him in 3 of the 4 counties to win my first election. I was re-elected without opposition, which I really thought was maybe more of a victory, both in showing people in rural South Georgia that I could handle the job and that women could handle the job in the state capital from the deepest part of South Georgia. When I had the chance to run for Secretary of State in 1998, no woman had ever run for this office or for almost any other statewide office. And let me tell you, almost every single week, if not every day of my campaign, I had to fend off questions of whether a woman could do the job. I would frequently remind them that the job did not involve heavy lifting. I tried to make, a little fun of the ridiculous nature of the question. But because they'd never seen a woman in the office, folks really could not imagine it. But I went to work, I raised the money, And I think we generated a lot of enthusiasm for the changing face of elections in 1998, and we won. At that time, only one other woman had ever been elected to a state constitutional office. That was their school superintendent, Linda Shrinko. So I often say I'm not the first woman elected to a constitutional office, but I am the first woman elected to a constitutional office who did not go to federal prison. That's a nice tag, isn't it? You'll have to look that one up if you don't know what I'm talking about. In 2006, I decided that if I really wanted to have an impact on the state, I should run for governor. And I did. I noticed a big difference from that first Secretary of State's race in 1998 in the number of people asking me outright whether a woman could do the job. Now, by this time, I had held the Secretary of State's job for 8 years. Occasionally, people would ask me that question, and my sense was that there were still folks who had doubts, but they just weren't willing to openly express it as much by 2006. There were more questions about whether a woman could really raise enough money to be a viable candidate as in a governor's race. But when I raised as much money as my wealthy and partially self-funded opponent, the lieutenant governor, did, about $6 million each of us, then I put that question to rest. Also, during that race, I ran into a lot of men, particularly, who would say, "Now, Cathy, you and the lieutenant governor just need to work it out," which meant, "Cathy, you just need to wait your turn. It's the man's turn to run for governor." And my response was typically, I don't generally try to pick fights, but I don't run from them either. And if I think I'm the better candidate in this race, I'm not going to step aside just so that a man can run. And if you know Georgia politics and a little Georgia history, back in 1990, when Zell Miller first ran for governor, after being the lieutenant governor for 16 years, there were a lot of other men interested in running for governor. They didn't step aside or work it out. In fact, 8 other men ran against Zell Miller in 1990. That included Andrew Young, Roy Barnes, Johnny Isaacson, and many others. Do you think anybody went to those men and said, "Work it out, be nice, and step aside"? Now, I didn't win that race for governor, or as I often say, the Lord rescued me from politics that year, and I began my journey into the world of higher education. But even in 2007, when I became the president at Young Harris College, I remember visiting the campus one weekend before I formally started the job, and I met some students who were standing out on the plaza on campus. And when I told them that I was going to be the new president starting in July, one of the students, a young man, said, "But you're a woman." He had never entertained the idea that a college president could be a woman. And here we are today, more than a decade after my last campaign, and I'm really dismayed to still hear a question about whether a woman can win an election, any election. Well, there are 2 professors from Northern Arizona University and Central Michigan University who conducted research in this area and found that when female candidates run, in a sense, they violate social norms, including pursuing ambitious political goals, and as a result, they are often disliked, making it difficult to win voters' support. These professors wrote about their study in a study called "Why Don't Women Rule the World? Understanding Women's Civic and Political Choices." And last month, they wrote about this in the Washington Post. And I want to quote them. They said, "Politics, so long dominated by men, has a masculine ethos. Women and men alike perceive political success as being linked to masculine traits such as self-promotion and fighting. Further, people around potential female candidates, from parents to party chairs, often do not think to encourage them to run for office. Women themselves often do not envision pursuing such a male-coded profession, which could make them appear to be more aggressive than nurturing. Saying a woman can't win the presidency reinforces all of those internalized barriers." End quote. I believe these professors have hit the proverbial nail on the head in identifying a root cause of voter anxiety over women candidates. And it's the same factor that plays into the issue of women's advancement in almost any job or profession. When women seek to run for office, or when women seek to move into fields that have been traditionally dominated by men, like law, like medicine, engineering, construction, even many academic areas and fields like college presidencies or certain academic disciplines, those women are seen by some as violating social norms, by some in society. They are perceived as too aggressive or assertive, too self-promoting or nurturing. They're seen as a bitch rather than a babe, right? If I had $1 for every time I've been called a bitch because I was a lawyer standing up for my client, or a politician advocating for an issue, or a college president or a dean having to make a tough decision, well, I would be a very wealthy woman. It seems to have gone with the territory. No doubt, in some people's eyes, I have not been playing to the nice Southern belle stereotype of women that they held in their view of the social norms for women. I was being unladylike, I suppose. But the times, they are a-changing. Women today now make up almost 24% of Congress, an all-time high. And that number grew 21% just in the last election cycle. In Georgia, women have also reached an all-time high of 30.5% of the membership of the General Assembly, when 7 additional women won seats in the Georgia House in the 2018 elections. But 24%, 30% are hardly representative of women in the population or in the voting population where women are a majority. The world is changing elsewhere, though. Last year, women became a majority of the students in medical schools. According to the American Association of Medical Colleges, women made up 50.5% of all students at medical colleges in the United States, compared to 49.4% of male students. Similarly, the most recent data on hand at the American Bar Association shows that women made up 51.3% of the entering classes at law schools around the country, compared to 48% of men. Women are growing in strength, maybe not quite as rapidly in fields like engineering and other STEM fields. So women are clearly making progress, moving into traditionally male-dominated professions, but why are we still questioning their abilities as leaders? When you think about it, the whole paradigm of leadership has changed in recent decades to a much more collaborative approach to leadership, rather than the top-down, dictatorial, demanding style of leadership that may have ruled the day before, say, the 1970s. And that's where I think women have an edge, in my opinion. The American Psychological Association reported on a study back to the 1990s on workplace behavior that shows women tend to be more democratic, encouraging participation, while men were more autocratic, directing performance. This article I read, entitled "When the Boss is a Woman," discussed other research showing women in work settings to more likely serve as role models, helping employees develop their skills and motivating them to be more dedicated and creative. It described research that showed women were slightly more likely than men to have a transformational leadership style in which the manager acted more like a good teacher or coach and encouraged creative solutions to problems. Women also appear more likely to reward good performances more so than men, a very positive part of transactional leadership. A recent Microsoft.com small business article quoted from a regional training director from the Mars-Venus Institute, you know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, who said, women managers tend to have more of a desire to build than a desire to win. Women are more willing to explore compromise and to solicit other people's opinions. By contrast, men often think that if they ask other people for advice, they might be perceived as unsure as a leader who doesn't have the answers. So again, why are we asking this confounding question? Well, a professor at Rutgers University and its Center for American Women in Politics notes that many commentators, voters, some political elites perpetuate this falsehood about women's capacity to succeed at the highest level of American politics because A, they haven't seen it to believe it, B, their fear gets stirred up when organizations talk about the hurdles that women sometimes have to go over en route to elective office, or C, sometimes people really just want to maintain a status quo that serves their own agendas. This professor at Rutgers, Kelly Dittmar, says that whether their fears are legitimate or cynical, they are factually incorrect. And she points out several things and documents them. Number one, can women succeed in elections, she says? Well, take this fact. A woman won nearly 3 million more votes for president than Donald Trump did in 2016. So a large majority of American voters are comfortable in voting for a woman. Now, of course, the Electoral College made the outcome differently, but the fact is, Americans are comfortable in voting for a woman and proved it in millions of votes, despite the mythology that continues. She points out, number two, women can and did win in swing votes, and it happened right here in Georgia. Georgia was one of those states that, in fact, women, those 7 women that I mentioned, were the ones who flipped the other party's seats to win new seats in the Georgia House of Representatives in 2018. Her third point is that women won at higher rates than men did in the 2018 election. She points out that non-incumbent women won primary and general elections at higher rates than non-incumbent men did in 2018 in congressional and statewide elected offices. And her final fourth point was that research consistently shows that gender is really not a disadvantage at the ballot box. She points out research that shows women can use their gender as an electoral advantage quite often by tapping into voters' desire to disrupt the male dominance that we've seen in this country for centuries in their perspectives, experiences, and power in our political institution. She does note, however, that women are still too frequently viewed through a monolithic lens of gender in ways that men are not. So, one of the biggest impediments we see in trying to address this question is that women candidates face voters who still have to be persuaded to believe in what can be, to believe in something they just haven't seen. Just like I had to answer that question in running for Secretary of State, to have Georgians believe a woman really could do the job even though they've never seen it. The facts are there, though. Women are winning. They're winning in larger and larger numbers. Women have all the capacity for 21st century leadership that anyone could ask for, because who really does want top-down models of leadership that we championed in this country for so long? So we really must stop playing to the stereotypes and the mythology that exist out there and give voters credit for sizing up candidates on issues and on matters of substance rather than playing to the stereotypes. Let's give voters credit for electing good people regardless of gender. I want to finish, though, with one of my favorite stories, and then I'd like to open it up to your questions. But I think it illustrates this world we live in. It comes from a documentary that was produced several years ago about all of the women who have served as presidents or prime ministers in their countries. And maybe, I hope many of you have studied enough world history to know that we're one of the few civilized countries that has not had a woman as a president or prime minister, because many, many countries have. But way up in the far north country of Iceland, they had a woman president for 16 years. She was actually the first democratically elected president in the world. Her name was Vigdis Finnbogadóttir. It's probably not the right pronunciation, but maybe close. She said in this documentary that because she had been president for so long, 4 consecutive 4-year terms, a whole generation of young children had grown up only seeing her as the president. And so parents would frequently come up to her and tell her that their little boys would come home from school and say, "Mom, can a boy grow up to be president?" It just depends on what you get used to seeing. I hope that you, students, are the generation who will believe in what can be, who will believe in what you don't have to see to believe. So let's quit asking the question about whether women can win, whether women can be leaders. Let's acknowledge the answers we already have. Yes, 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 and yes. Let's move on and ask questions that really matter. Thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you, Dean Cox, for your comments. And we have some time for some questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. And you can ask your question and we can have a bit of a discussion. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Hi, Emerson. You get the first question.
Okay, great. I was just going to ask, what initially sparked your interest to run for Secretary of State after you were a lawyer?
A good question. I often say I have the defective political genes of a child who grew up in politics because I truly inherited it from my dad. He was a city councilman and a mayor of my hometown when I was a child, and my sisters and I literally learned to campaign for my dad. When we were in elementary school, my mother would put us out on the street with a stack of my dad's cards and say, go to every house, knock on the door, ask them to vote for your daddy, and I'll pick you up at the end of the street. And we always got excited at election time because it was fun on election night to have the results come in. And fortunately, he never really had an ugly campaign. He won all of his races. And so we saw him do good things through politics. He was elected to the legislature when I was about 14. So all through my high school and college years, my dad was in the legislature. And back in the days when you could get a newspaper in the morning, we would read the newspaper at breakfast, and he would read the stories with me about the legislature, and it would say, today they're going to do so-and-so in the legislature, and my dad would say, well, now this is what the speaker says, but here's what's really going to happen. And I learned sort of the intrigue of what was going to happen in the legislature and how the process worked and how what somebody is quoted as saying is not necessarily what they meant, and all the art of compromise that was going to have to work in the legislature for something to get passed. And I was just fascinated by it. So by the time I was a senior in college, I got to intern in the legislature. I hope some of you will take advantage of becoming an intern in the Georgia legislature. You get to do that from a Georgia public college because it's a great experience to be there and be an aide to a committee. I just always knew I wanted to do something in politics because I really only saw the good side of it. My dad was diagnosed with cancer after I became a lawyer and moved back to my hometown to practice law. And I honestly don't know that he really ever wanted me to get into politics because I think he knew the bad side of it and probably would not have wanted that for his little girl. But I was hooked. And I knew that I wanted to do it at some point. So a couple of years after he passed away, I had the chance to run for the legislature. And it turned out reapportionment had happened where they redraw the district lines. So I got to run in 2 counties where he had been the representative and 2 new counties that I had to learn. But it was an advantage, certainly, that people knew. I knew people there. They knew me. They knew I was Walter's daughter and that kind of thing. And it was an advantage going into the legislature like that. I served 2 terms in the legislature and was invited by Lewis Massey, who was appointed Secretary of State, to work with him as Assistant Secretary of State. And I had to give up my House seat at the end of my term to join him in the Secretary of State's office. And I loved that. 2 years later, he decided not to run for re-election, but to run for governor. So everybody sort of looked around and said, well, who's going to run for Secretary of State? And it was kind of like, I will. I know the job. I have no money. I don't know anything about running a statewide election, but I'll do it. And so that was almost how it happened. But if I had an advantage there, it was that while I was in the legislature, even though I was an elected Democrat, I had developed a lot of friendships with my Republican colleagues in the House. And they liked me, and they felt like I would be fair to them. And I had treated them well during my 2 years already in the Secretary of State's office. So there was no concerted effort to find a strong opponent to run against me. I had an opponent, and they might have all voted for him because he was of their party, but it was, in the end, a good election and not so hard to win because I had a lot of across-the-aisle support. And I tried to operate as Secretary of State in a very nonpartisan way because if I could change anything about state government, it would be to make some certain constitutional offices nonpartisan, because I don't think the functions of the Secretary of State should be partisan. When you run elections, when you incorporate businesses, when you issue professional licenses and things like that, it really is a nonpartisan function that, in my view, shouldn't be operated on a partisan basis. And so I think that helped me over the years that I served in that office to not gin up automatic opposition. It also helped to be a lawyer in that office because I understood the law. I got sued all the time as Secretary of State because I understood that's how issues got resolved. When people had an election dispute, they had to bring the Secretary of State in as a party to oftentimes to get a matter resolved. One of the cases went all the way to the United States Supreme Court on reapportionment matters because I was the Secretary of State who handled elections, so I had to be the defendant in the suit. So there's a Cox versus Larios lawsuit that's now on the books at the United States Supreme Court, and I got to go with the Attorney General's office to the U.S. Supreme Court and get admitted, and was able to, because I was a lawyer, talk to the Attorney General's office about how we're going to handle the argument, and this, because I knew exactly what was going on. It was a real benefit to be a lawyer and to run that office, to be a lawyer and understand businesses that incorporated their businesses and know how I could help them speed up that process and make it easier for lawyers. So over the course of all of these things I've been able to do, it's been a big benefit to have that legal education. Long answer, but thank you for the question.
So you've had a lot of different positions and in different fields throughout your life. How have you known when it's time to transition? And as we're students transitioning out of college, what advice do you have for us?
That's a very, very thoughtful question. There's no magic answer of how I know, how I ever knew when to make a transition or how to make a decision. And I'm a person of faith, and so I pray that the Lord would lead me in the right directions, and generally it would come back to my gut feeling. For example, when I made that decision as a member of the House of Representatives, when Louis Massey asked me to join him as Assistant Secretary of State, it meant I had to give up my seat in the House of Representatives and move from my home district back to Atlanta. And a lot of people thought I had lost my mind. But in those days, this was almost sort of pre-internet days, which tells you how old I am. And so to practice law, driving back and forth to Atlanta from South Georgia all the time was really difficult. And I sort of was at a point of deciding I've either got to practice law full-time or do politics full-time. And this opportunity came along, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting to me. And it just strikes me as the right opportunity at the right time in my life. I wasn't married. I had no children. I don't know where it will lead. Might not lead anywhere, but I'm going to do it. And I don't know that my mother even understood it, but it opened up tremendous opportunities for me. And every time you run for political office, you know there's always an incredible gamble that you might lose. But I think, again, having a law degree in my back pocket, I always knew that if I don't win, I can support myself. I can go back to practicing law tomorrow. So I always could weigh out the risk and the pros and the cons. And if there's anything that I would hope, especially you women in the room, would appreciate, is that men are much better at taking risk in your careers than women tend to be. And sometimes women don't get as far in life because they're afraid to take risk and they're afraid to fail. And there's nothing to be afraid of in failure, because you just generally learn some lessons and move on in another direction. Now, you have to make educated decisions on how you balance those risks, but it truly is a world of nothing ventured, nothing gained. And you can play it safe all your life, and you can stay right in this place. and you might be really happy in that place. And there's nothing wrong with staying in that place. But you might also miss all the rest of that world that's out there if you don't decide to take a few chances in your careers. And so you've got to weigh out those risks and appreciate in yourself, you'll still be you tomorrow, even if it's not a success. But take a chance on something good and big and better, and set a big goal for yourself, because there's such an exciting world out there for you that if your gut feels good about it and it's a career choice that's exciting to you, then just go for it. And know you might have to work really hard for it. Nothing wrong with that, because the benefits are going to be tremendous. So don't take the easy road, because you're all smarter people than that.
We have time for some more questions. What other questions do we have?
A brave man.
In your kind of concluding story about the Icelandic president, it kind of came out that like role models play a big part in kind of growing up. So I was wondering if you had any female role models. I know you mentioned your dad already, but female role models or role models today that can be role models for all of us that you recommend.
Well, thank you. There have certainly been role models that I've seen from afar as lawyers, women, not obviously in my hometown, where I sort of had to wing it and plow my own ground, but there are, lots of women on the United States Supreme Court and women that I've read about. I love to read biographies and study women lawyers who have succeeded, and even back to my childhood of watching TV shows like, this will really date me, because Mary Tyler Moore, who was a TV anchor back in the days when I wanted to go to journalism school, she was this cool, young, single woman doing things that women had never done. But watching lawyers like that, women lawyers who could get up and argue really strongly and effectively, just inspired me to know that I could do this, even though there weren't any women in South Georgia, weren't many women in that path. In political fields, there had been several women in the legislature who served with my dad, and I knew some of them and thought they were really strong, courageous women. They were sort of stuck under the good old boy system that existed in the legislature, and very few, if any of them, were ever made committee chairman or rose into much of the leadership of the legislature. But I knew they were there. I watched whenever they got up to argue particular issues, and I was so proud of what they did. And because when I would go visit my dad, they would sort of take me under their wing. So I followed a lot of their careers, and a number of them have passed away now. Some of them are still living, and I stay in touch with them. But over the years, now that I've been back at the law school, in fact, in December, we had a program to celebrate 100 years of women graduating from Mercer Law School. And it's mind-boggling to think about what it must have been like to be a woman in 1919, to graduate from Mercer Law School. Only the second woman to graduate from any law school in the state. Nobody would hire her. She finally ended up moving to New Jersey and got a job teaching, because nobody in the state would hire her to be a lawyer. And that went on even into the 1960s and 70s, when women who graduated still couldn't get jobs as lawyers. They had to get jobs as law librarians or legal secretaries, because law firms wouldn't hire them with a bona fide JD degree, passing the bar. And so those women had it so much harder than me, but they paved the way for me and a lot of other people to see things differently. And a lot of men along the way ultimately had to join their cause and say, this is not right. And sometimes it was a spouse. Sometimes it was just a good-thinking gentleman who said, this is not right, and they're equally as capable as I am to do these things and help to open those doors. And I've read lots of their stories too, and they're equally as inspiring. Thank you.
So I have a question. Oh, we're going to have someone go first.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I really appreciated it. So you mentioned that in the 2016 election that Hillary Clinton won by the majority vote, but not in the Electoral College, and that our country has experienced a variety of progress in terms of women in political careers, but it's still not enough or not representative. So what do you think it will take for our country to finally flip the narrative and for women to be accurately represented in political careers?
Well, I think it's going to be one of those things where until people see it, they're still going to be asking this inane question, and ignoring these facts that are out there about the fact that women are winning, that women are getting millions and millions of votes, and overlooking the just obvious facts that women are winning. Women have made voters comfortable in voting for them, but that's not to say everybody, and everybody will always have some story to tell of their grandmother or their neighbor or somebody that is making the comment that they just won't vote for a woman or whatever. And we still have, just like I mentioned, the Rutgers professor who says women are still kind of judged in the monolithic lens. You still see women getting criticized for their hair and their clothes and all of the things that I used to get so tired of as Secretary of State. I'd be on TV talking about some issue of great importance, and the next day in the office the phone would start ringing, and I'd think, oh wow, people were listening, and they'd all be calling to ask where I got my hair cut or where did I buy that suit. I'm like, really? They don't even know what I said. And even when I announced for governor, I had this big rally in my hometown down in Bainbridge. I had hundreds of people on the town square announcing my campaign for governor, and a reporter from the Atlanta newspaper, he plowed his way up to the front, and he had his pad. He wanted to ask me a question, so my press secretary made way for him to get up front and said, "What's your question, Jim?" And he said, "Where did you get that brooch that you're wearing?" I said, "Really? That's your question?" "Yeah, it's very pretty. I think I bought it, at Macy's, or whatever." That was his only question when I just announced for governor. Now, how many times do you ever hear anybody ask a male candidate about their hair, their clothes, their weight, what their tie looks like? I mean, it just does not happen. And so until we can get a woman in there making the decisions and making the policy that maybe could put a lot more of that to the side, I guess there's just going to continue to be some of that. And truthfully, women are some of the worst about that than men. So we can be our own worst enemies when it comes to some of that. But until we can get beyond that, believe what can be, it's going to, I guess, continue until people say, don't ask that question. Here are the facts. Don't play to the stereotypes. And we've all got to be willing to speak up to put kind of those things to rest.
Okay, my question is one that commonly gets asked is, what's your favorite books? But I'm going to twist it just a little bit. What are you currently reading or listening to in a podcast?
Well, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen every morning to Bill Nigut's Political Rewind, because I'm still a political junkie. So if you want to keep up with Georgia politics, that's a great podcast to listen to. It's a daily news show out of Atlanta, and they always talk about what's happening at the state capitol. They talk about what's happening in Congress. It's a part of Georgia Public Broadcasting, Political Rewind. almost finished with a book called Fierce Conversations, which I recommend to you. It's about how to have tough conversations. It's about, it's really a good book for people who are managers. It's a good book for leaders. It's a good book it would be a great book for any of you to read. It's an easy read about how easy we all try to tend to not have those hard conversations with somebody who's in your workplace, who's doing poorly, and you just want to brush things under the table. You don't want to upset the apple cart. But it's about how to have honest conversations with people, how to be open to yourself when, and not go through life going, hey, how you doing? Good, fine, just having totally superficial conversations all the time. It's about fierce conversations, about being real and authentic in all of your conversations. And it's given me some really great ideas in terms of managing personnel, but it's really a nice book to think about in just your relationships with your peers, of how to deepen your friendships and be more authentic and meaningful in your conversations with other people, because you're going to all find out, the older and older you get, what is most meaningful in life is not going to be your title, your car, your house, your salary. It's going to be your relationships with other people. And you won't have those relationships in meaningful ways unless you work to have those relationships and open yourself up and start listening and taking in what you can get from other people in terms of who they are and what they care about and what their life is like. So it's a really good book.
Hi. As students, we often learn that leadership is not necessarily defined by a position of power, but rather a dedication to service or some cause. What is an example or a person from your life where you found this particularly compelling?
Repeat the last part of your sentence.
What's a case or a person where you found this particularly compelling?
A case or person? I'm sorry, I'm just not hearing.
So maybe somebody not in a position of leadership, but who exemplified leadership in your life.
Oh, okay. The first part of your question, I think, is exactly squarely right on point. That talk about stereotypes of women. The stereotype of a leader is somebody with the big title, the big power. And in my opinion, the best, most effective leaders can be pretty quiet people. Because I think the best, most effective leaders are actually good listeners. I don't think you can be a good leader without being a good listener. And if you want to lead, if you want to move or motivate or incentivize people to do something they would not necessarily do themselves, you got to understand where they are now. You can't people don't respond. Maybe they did 50 years ago, but people don't respond to just edicts and dictates. People are thinking people, and you've got to understand who they are and what kind of people you're dealing with and what motivates them. And you've got to develop some trust to be a good leader. And you cannot do that without being a good listener. So when I think back at people I've served with in politics and people in the legislature, it's so dominated by the big mouths and the loud mouths and the people who don't ever listen. And to me, they're such a turnoff, the antithesis of what I think of as a leader. And I gravitate much more toward people who are quiet leaders because they get to know a group, and all of a sudden, before you know it, everybody's on the bandwagon, without even realizing they're being led because they've all bought into an argument or they've bought into a cause. There's a woman in Macon, her name is Claire Cox. She's the wife of one of my law school classmates, and I think she is a powerful leader. And she's organized a women's group in Macon. It's called Georgia Women, parentheses, and those who stand with them. And they are a really motivated women's group, nonpartisan, non-political, that takes on a lot of social justice issues. And Claire is so skilled as a leader, but she's quiet. She's an engineer, and engineers are, admittedly almost nerdily organized and that kind of thing, but she's effective because she knows the people that are in her groups. She knows what they're interested in. She's really organized. She's very transparent in talking about what she wants the group to do and how they can mold and shift their objectives until everybody's on board and everybody's gung-ho to go. And they get amazing things accomplished because they all buy in, as opposed to somebody coming in as the president banging a gavel and saying, "We shall do this." So it goes back to my initial thing about leadership skills can be learned, because it's not about being the biggest mouthpiece in the room. It's about learning how to work and interact with people.
I want to thank you all for your questions, and let's please thank our
Thank
guests,
you all very much
Dean
for your
Cathy
attention.
Cox.
The Inspire Leadership Series is brought to you by Georgia College Leadership Programs. Join the conversation with us at Lead Creatively on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, or on Facebook at Georgia College Leadership Programs. This video was produced by Bobcat Studios, Georgia College's award-winning, student-led media production company.